resilience. So resilience is a control to make sure that things fail safely. That's the whole point of it. You want things to bend, not break. So by failing safely, failing securely, what you want to make sure is that should some process fail, should some system fail, that it does it in a secure way. And in a secure way, meaning that it doesn't allow unauthorized access or unauthorized trusts to happen. Now, resilience is kind of a difficult thing to get in place because uh, you want to make sure that your controls are robust enough that they're not going to fail on you. So that's really what resilience is protecting, your controls more than your assets, right? So resilience is making sure that your assets can continue to be provided, your operations work, uh, that there is no failure. But if there is a failure, that it fails closed, not open. And the thing is that it's not really a control that's used as much as it should be, mostly because it's hard. It's hard to match resilience with continuity. So putting those two together is kind of tough because normally when things start to fail, continuity says, hey, we move over here and we continue. But the problem is that should something fail and it fails in the wrong way, unauthorized access could continue despite the fact that operations shifted over. So in the example of a reverse proxy, where you have two web servers, and one web server, should it get overloaded, the reverse proxy moves the traffic over to the next one so that no people are denied service. Now what happens though is that it gets overloaded, uh, and when it gets overloaded, it actually starts failing, okay, meaning it allows logins, inappropriate logins to come through, or it messes up the password policy that's required in order to make a new password. I mean, I've seen all sorts of weird things happen through denial of service, through buffer overflows, through just mistakes that happen. And the thing is, although continuity will shift it over, most of the traffic over to the other server, the first server is still compromised. Uh, and so the idea here is with the resilience control, you want to make sure that it just shuts down, that when there's a corruption, that it's where something bad could go on, that it actually just fails completely. Um, One of the things I like to tell people is that it's happened to me a few times actually, is going to sleep in a hotel room and waking up in the morning and finding the door open a crack. And of course, wondering to myself, okay, did I leave it open? Did somebody come in the middle of the night while I was sleeping? And of course, it freaks you out, right? That's because these doors have no resilience controls. So basically, the idea of a resilience control would mean that if somebody opens the door, it's broken. And I would know that it was broken. I would know that somebody actually came in and forced their way in the night. There was no mistaking it, okay? And of course, doing so would be loud and would notify me. I mean, the resilience control would mean that if that door was to fail, meaning somebody picked the lock, it would just fall in on itself and make a huge noise and wake me up. That would be a good resilience control for a hotel room, but that doesn't exist, right? So if somebody picks the lock and comes in, they could leave, and I would never know they were there unless they happened to leave the door open a little. Now, I'm not sure what happened. I don't know if that happened. Of course, the first thing I do is I go crazy looking to see what was stolen. But the point is that that is no resilience control. And of course, it has continuity because I can always reuse the door and the lock again, which doesn't really help me to know if I've been robbed or not until I go through and I check all the assets. And of course, the danger of it as well, if they killed me in my sleep or something. But then I wouldn't have to check the assets, right? So people have trouble with understanding what resilience control is, but the resilience control really is just about making sure that things fail in a secure way when they fail. Yeah. Non-repudiation. That's basically making sure that you know that you can account for who did what action. Now, again, identity plays a part in this, and we know that there's problems with identification. We also know that trying to identify somebody online is really hard. Attribution over the internet is extremely difficult, extremely. Uh, so anybody who says, if you watch movies, you think that you can just pinpoint somebody over their IP address and where they are and track them back, it doesn't really work that way. Uh, it's very difficult, especially if people jump through different servers and that kind of thing before they attack. So attribution, extremely hard online. Um, and so non-repudiation is one of those things where we say, okay, we might not know the identity specific of the person, but we know that this identity did these things. Okay, so that's how you have to look at non-repudiation. Basically, making sure that you know who did the interactivity, even if you don't know who the who really is. Um, Again, non-repudiation is most of these controls, like non-repudiation, works really good in pairs with other things like indemnification and authentication. Uh, these kinds of things work together in groups, and I think maybe now you can actually see it as we've gone through enough controls. You would say that any one control sitting on its own is pretty damn weak, which is kind of amazing because it's not uncommon to find just an authentication control in place. Sure, now you'll see now with HTTPS and SSH, a lot of times people are smart enough to know that they can't just have authentication unless it's encrypted. So you will see combine the confidentiality control and authentication. So at least those two. But one on its own is very weak, and even two on its own is pretty weak. And if you think about it, the controls that we have, the whole point of the controls is that we talk about defense and width. Okay, so having all 10 controls protects you against all threats, and we'll go more into that later. But it should become clear as you see this that so many of these controls really depend on other controls to work optimally. And without them, they kind of have inherent limitations. So, for example, indemnification without non-repudiation, you can't say who did it. So you can't call the police. You can't actively stop an attacker unless you know who did the attacking. So you kind of need them all together. Okay, confidentiality. Now, the two that people confuse all the time is confidentiality and privacy. They're two different things. Confidentiality is protecting the message. So you send a message to me, that message is encrypted. Nobody in the middle can read that message. Okay, that is confidentiality. That's the whole point of that. So you sending me the message, it being encrypted. And privacy is a control for assuring that the way something is accessed, okay, or how the interaction occurs is not disclosed to outside parties. So, for example, uh, under the privacy control, it doesn't matter whether or not the message is encrypted that you pass me. The privacy control is that nobody saw how you passed me the message. Now, you can see probably from a military standpoint even how powerful that could be. So it's not just the message that's passing across, but the means of how the message is getting across is also unknown. And unfortunately, criminals figured this out a long time ago because that's kind of how a lot of drug deals are made. Not only are they encrypted, the messages, but the means of how they're contacting each other is often private. It's hidden from authorities in trying to find them. And privacy as a control on servers is pretty powerful as well too. So, for example, using a default install of a service. So you add a new Apache service to a web server. You do the default install without changing the name of the directories, without changing the login name for the administrator, default ports. Even SSH is a big one. You can move default ports, so it's not 22, so robots can't hammer away at it online. All of these things, changing those things, making it private, okay? And you can call it obscurity, I suppose, if you want, but not everything is obscurity because some things are really hard to guess because they're huge numbers of guesses that would need to be made in order to guess some of these directory names. And sort of kind of how Tor and onion routing works with having random long names for their directories for their nodes. Um, and that's the privacy control. And privacy control is extremely important because it's hard for an attacker to attack you if they can't figure out if there's anything there to attack, if they can't figure out the way in. And I mean, this it's something so simple to do from implementation on that I'm surprised it's not done more often because it really is powerful. Just moving your SSH from 22 to port 60,008, you're going to see a lot less traffic, okay? And you're only going to find authorized people who are trying to get in there because they're going to know to find the port. Sure, somebody can port scan you, but there's things you can deal with that too. So another way to do this is I've seen the privacy control on web servers where they've made every response be a 200. So that means every time that somebody does a scan of your web server looking for hidden files, looking for hidden directories, all that, every single response from your web server is yes, yes, yes. And so what ends up happening is that the people who are scanning and looking for real stuff, they're like, oh my God, they have this, they have this, they have this. And then shortly after, 100 scans goes through, they realize something's wrong and that they're all false positives. And so even if there are some true positives in there, they're not going to find them because they're not going to go through the thousands of false positives to get there. They'll just move on to another target. And that's due to the privacy control. So you've basically hidden something in plain sight. Your stuff is still there. It's just not that easy to find. Okay, integrity as a control, also something that it's been out there since as far as the early 90s that I know, integrity controls, especially file integrity, and it's not as in big of use as you would think today. So as a control, integrity basically says if something gets changed, we should know what it is, what the change was, when it happened, that kind of thing. And there's even systems like I think Tripwire was a big one that would change it back. So it had a read-only version or on other media, read-only media, and it would just change it back. Now in the 90s, it was a big deal because most web pages were pretty static. You didn't have a lot of dynamic content, which meant you could actually run it directly off of read-only media if you wanted to, because updating it didn't happen that often. And so the main part of your information. So it was really hard to hack a website and tag it basically, or change the index page, the main index page, to say something hacky or funny, because the moment you made the change, the integrity control would kick in and replace it within milliseconds of the original. So the moment you made the change, you're like, hey, I got in, and then you go back to view your work and it's not there. It didn't work. So integrity control is very interesting for files, for all sorts of things, but making sure that change can't happen unless you allow it to. And then finally, you have alarm. Alarm is a control that's very interesting as well because it basically tells you when any of the other controls have been broken or circumvented. But it doesn't just tell you about that. It has to do it within a time period that you can react to it. So it's more like an alert. Now, a log file is a lousy alarm because you might check it once every month. But now with SIMs, with systems to actually grab log files and keep on them and show you alert based on those log files, it's actually become something very different these days. It's log files in that sense that get sucked up and moved through a SIM could be an alarm, and it could give you a chance to react to it. So those are the main definitions that we wanted to go through on controls. There's 10 of them, and they are more powerful in groups than they are alone.